We encourage you to prioritize your own well-being and seek support if needed. Our team will be also sharing resources in the chat, so should you need any support during the webinar. Remember that taking care of yourself is crucial in order to effectively support others, which is why we're here today. By participating in this training, you acknowledge and understand that the information presented is not intended to replace professional advice, and any actions taken based on the content are at your own discretion and responsibility. We highly recommend consulting with mental health professionals or other relevant experts for guidance if you have any questions or any crisis. Now that we have that out of the way, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for sharing where you are joining us from in the chat. Today, we're going to have an amazing speaker who also happens to be my husband. So maybe I'm biased, but I think he is great. So we're going to have an amazing presentation on the topic for about 45 to 50 minutes. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A and group discussion. So again, feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation and engage with us in the chat, or go off mute, raise your hand, whatever makes you feel more comfortable. And also you may save any questions to the Q&A section should you want to keep that out of the recording. Now, for the fun part, let's welcome our speaker for today. We have Abraham Scully. Abraham is a dynamic and inspiring speaker, a best-selling author, mental health advocate, and educational consultant dedicated to empowering students, entrepreneurs, and business owners. With a focus on enhancing productivity, preventing burnout, and fostering a harmonious personal and professional balance, Abraham equips individuals with practical wellness strategies that drive lasting success. Drawing from his personal journey of overcoming mental health challenges during college, Abraham is a passionate advocate for spreading awareness and creating safe spaces for open conversations about mental health and well-being. His impactful work has garnered recognition from STEAM media outlets such as Business Insider, MTV, Word in Black, Meetup, UW Newsroom, and Mental Health America. As the visionary founder and CEO of Speaks to Inspire, Abraham leads a dedicated team that prioritizes the mental health and overall well-being of students and young professionals. Now, without further ado, we welcome Abraham to the stage.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm super excited to be here and to have you on this session. I know that we are virtual, and unfortunately, we're not able to bring this to you in person, but I want to bring that same feel of engagement and closeness as much as we can. So if you can come on video, I'd love to see your face. I see Dr. Steve Mayfield's face, and I'd love to see many other faces if you can. If you cannot, that's totally fine. You'll have tons of opportunities to engage in the chat. So thank you all for being here. I see Nicole. Oh my goodness, long time no see. It's good to see you. It's good to see you, Mary. Awesome. So we're going to dive right into it. We only are here for a limited amount of time, and I will preface it by saying there's going to be a lot of information. There's going to be so much content. It's going to be extremely valuable, and you're probably going to want to grab your notepad, but no fears. You will receive the recording, the slides, and you'll have access to us to ask any questions after the presentation if you have any. So with that being said, just know that if you'd like to revisit any of the content, you'll have access as soon as we leave this session. So I'd love to know who's tuning in and where you're tuning in from. So if you can drop in the chat, if you already did it, I apologize. I stepped away for just a minute, but if you can drop in the chat, where are you tuning in from around the world? I know we have people from all over. I'd love to see where you're tuning in from. You can just share it in the chat. We got Brooklyn, Awesome. The Jed Foundation. Awesome. We got Fairbanks, Arkansas, Gainesville, Pensacola, Minnesota, Jacksonville. Awesome. Awesome. So we're touching all parts of United States, right? So let's keep them coming. I'm super excited. You're going to have a lot of fun. I hope that this material is material that you can engage with. And my goal is to create a safe space and give practical tools that can help you to enhance your own well-being. As you have heard from Estefania, our goal at Speaks to Inspire is to build that bridge and to really, create an infrastructure around supporting student mental health and well-being. And if our educators and helping professionals aren't doing well, then how well can we help our students? So this presentation, this workshop, this webinar is for you, and the sole purpose is to provide value to you. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I start off with a question because I always want to hear perspectives. What is a person, place, or thing that brings you peace? And maybe this is something over the last 6 months that you started doing. Maybe it's something since COVID happened and you've been exposed to other tools and ideas that kind of bring you peace. Share in the chat. What is a person, place, or thing that brings you peace? Prayer, I see in the chat. Taking a walk outside. I love it. For me, I got into this new habit of laying in my hammock. So the cool thing about it is it's super cost effective. And as long as we have great weather in Pensacola, Florida, all I need is 2 trees. All right. So the hammock lifestyle has been great. Morning yoga. Awesome. Awesome. So these are things that we can rely on, especially when times get busy, work is busy, life becomes stressful. And those are these little moments and activities that we can engage in, or people that we can spend time with to bring us back to that sense of peace that we have within us. I was an educator for about 1.5 years, is how long I lasted in education. And I taught 6th grade, and it was one of the life-changing experiences for me. A couple of things that I noticed was there was a huge gap when it came to resources and accessibility to resources as it pertains to student mental health and well-being. The other thing that I realized is that anyone who is an educator, they automatically become a mother. They automatically become a coach, a father, an uncle, a mentor, a doctor, a counselor. It's almost as if you're given this role and this responsibility to teach a subject matter, but then you're also playing these different roles and wearing these different hats. And what I found out very quickly in getting into education is that there is a level of admiration that we must have for our educators. So if there's any educator that is in the chat, just drop a 7 in the chat. If you are currently in education, or you are a former educator, or you work in education in some capacity. So we have some 7s in the chat. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you so much for your work. And it's greatly appreciated. I am aware that school is actually coming up, if it has not already started, for some educators. And so what better time to prioritize our own mental health and well-being? So a couple of things that I want to talk about is, as I was in education and I was exposed to the barriers to seeking support services, not just for students, but for educators, and how sometimes our hands are tied when it comes to supporting our students because we have many different responsibilities. I found that there were opportunities to provide more resources for educators, opportunities to prioritize our educators' mental health and well-being, to equip them with the tools that they need in order to operate at an optimal level. And during my time in education, I not only took the liberty of creating a safe space within my own classroom, But I also took the initiative in creating conversations outside of my classroom so that students as well as staff members knew that it was a safe space in Mr. Scully's room to talk about different challenges that we wouldn't necessarily have elsewhere. And that's actually something that educators can also do once we realize that we have the ability to take that initiative. I also found that it really just starts with one conversation. It starts with one conversation of how are you doing really? Typically in education, everything is moving so fast. Everything, we have deadlines, we have responsibilities, and we move so fast that we don't take as much time to check in. And there are small opportunities throughout the day where we can check in with our students, where we can check in with our colleagues. And those things, they do take work, right? But in the end, it helps us to develop this culture and this space that is safe for those who need the supports. So we're talking about burnout, and that's the conversation and ways that we can prioritize our mental health, ways that we can engage in these conversations. And I was doing some research and I found a statistic from a study that was done by Gallup. And it stated that 44% of K through 12 employees say they are always or very often burnt out at work. And as I'm doing this research, I found that the same study identified that teachers and educators are more burnt out in the United States than any other industry. But how often do we think about the mental health and well-being of educators? What do we have in place to support our educators? So the first thing I thought about was, well, in order for us to even address burnout, we have to start from the very beginning. What is it? How do we define it? How can we identify it? Right? So burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. So as you're hearing this definition of burnout, is there anyone that's attending live and maybe you felt these feelings, you felt burnt out, you've experienced this in your own life, whether it's in your work, your personal life? You can just drop a me in the chat if you've ever been there. I'll be the first to put 2 hands up. I have been there, and more recently, last year was an experience where I really had to shut everything down. I was operating at a level that was superhuman, and I forgot that I'm a human being. And so life said, all right, Abraham, you're gonna have to sit down somewhere. And I had to sit down somewhere and really prioritize me. Sometimes those of us who are in this role of being an educator, being an advocate, being a supporter, being a helping professional, we give, do, and we forget to be. We forget that we're human beings. And to increase our capacity to do more, we actually have to be more. We have to prioritize ourselves. We have to prioritize our well-being. So I want to play this quick video. Some of you may know who this is. If you know who this is, say me in the chat. If you know who this is, say me in the chat. I'm going to play this quick video, and then I want to open it up just to hear some of your takeaways. I see Mary says me.
And then I got on stage and I performed. And a lot of people were like, I saw you in Santa Barbara and you were amazing. I'm like, I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And then I walked off stage and I was still crying and I was still sad. And that had never happened. And I said, you know what? This is going to get in the way of my livelihood.
Damn right.
The thing that makes me the most happy. So I was like, you
seek some help.
Yeah, you gotta pay that money to make that money too. I was like, I'm gonna invest in this because this is my life investment.
Invest in your mental wealth.
Come on, mental health, mental wealth.
And you're probably the first person in your family who had the luxury of going to seeking some healing.
That is very, very true. The privilege to be able to go see a therapist, the privilege to be able to afford health care is another reason why in our community you don't see us seeking out counseling as much. But for anybody who does need to talk to somebody, like, mentorship is really important, and finding somebody that is just willing to listen to you, that cares about you.
So I'd like to open it up for anyone that wants to share. You can come off of mute or you can share it in the chat. What did you hear? What was one thing that stood out for you as you were listening to Lizzo speak? Anything?
Everybody
I see
struggles.
Nicole.
Everybody struggles, even celebrities.
Awesome. Yeah, great takeaway. Doesn't matter what level, what status you're at. We all struggle. Great takeaway, Steve. I see Nicole's hand.
Another takeaway is that there is still a stigma, even after everything we went through with COVID, that we can't seek mental health.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? I'll take one more. So I see Mary says in the chat, I love the verbiage. Investing, quote, investing in your mental health, because that's exactly what it is. A long-term investment of time, energy, funds, etc. Drop a 7 in the chat if you agree with what Mary just said. Oh my goodness. It's a long-term investment. And sometimes you don't see the return as quickly as you see the return when you invest in the stock market, right? Sometimes the investment in our mental health, we see those returns much later. But I love the terminology, the language, investing. So paying attention to the signs, listening to our bodies. One thing that I realized is that our bodies are always speaking to us, always speaking, but we may not always be listening and we may not always be aware, right? So the one way my body speaks to me is sometimes when I have a lot on my plate, I have a lot of responsibilities. I tend to move around more frequently with my shoulders up, right? Or I'm a little bit more tense. Maybe my chest is a little bit more tense. And that's a sign that my body is saying, hey, you're experiencing some stress. Sometimes I recognize that I have the self-awareness to know, okay, my shoulders are up. I'm clenching my jaw. I'm clenching my fist. And then I can respond to what my body is saying. But oftentimes, our bodies and what it is saying, it becomes so habitual that we don't even have the self-awareness to know that our bodies are speaking to us. So let's talk about it. A couple ways that our bodies can speak to us, right? Physical, mental, and or emotional, or behavioral. So what are some of the signs that we can look out for? When we're talking about physical signs, things like fatigue, sleep issues, maybe going to sleep and getting 7 hours, getting 8 hours, right? And waking up and still feeling tired. Appetite and weight issues. Losing a lot of weight and you're not trying to lose a lot of weight, right? Or gaining a lot of weight and maybe you're not eating as much, but you're tending to put on more weight. Frequent illness. Oftentimes we forget that what we're going through mentally, psychologically, also affects our physical body. And many individuals who experience mental health challenges are affected physically, right? So a weakened immune system, catching a cold a little bit more frequently, it's easier to catch different illnesses, and it's harder to treat these different illnesses because of that weakened immune system. And then we talk about mental and emotional. So this is where it's just very difficult to concentrate. You ever been in a conversation where you're present, you're looking at the person, you're watching their lips, you're looking at their eyes, but for whatever reason, you're not really there. It's like you're in your head, you're thinking about something else, right? Or just forgetting things easily. Self-doubt. Many people report that when they are experiencing burnout or leading up to that burnout, it's a sense of self-doubt, not having confidence in yourself like you typically do. And this is a sign. This is a sign that we can look out for and be mindful of. feeling alone, right? Feeling like you're the only one that is experiencing it. The only one that has ever experienced it. A couple years ago, I wrote a book called Unlearn the Lies. And in the book, I highlighted 7 specific lies or misconceptions that we hold around mental health and mental illness. And these are the lies that keep us suffering in silence, right? And one of those lies that I write about is the fact that when you are depressed, typically there's this feeling, this thought, this belief that you're the only one who's experiencing what you're experiencing, and no one else has ever been there, and therefore no one can even help you, right? But that's a misconception. So it's these feelings of, I'm alone, there's no one there, loss of motivation. And it's a very difficult thing to be in a field or doing work that you absolutely enjoy, but yet you lose all motivation. For many people, that can be a pivotal moment in their lives to where for them, their lives even tend to lose meaning because this thing that I have devoted my life to, I no longer want to do. And it's not that they no longer want to do it, they may be burnt out. And one of the signs of burnt out is losing that motivation, a cynical outlook on life. And then we talk about behaviorally, right? So procrastinating with responsibilities. I'm not going to call anyone out if you consider yourself a procrastinator, right? But with this type of procrastinating, it's almost at a level higher than what you typically procrastinate, right? So at this point, you're putting everything to the side. And as a matter of fact, you're doing all the little things just to feel like you're busy so that you are not doing those things that are truly significant, truly important. And this is a sign, right? Coming in late to work, coping with food, drugs, alcohol. It's that sensation of, I have so much on my plate, I need a drink. I have so much on my plate, I need food. I have so much on my plate, I need to smoke something, right? And if we're not mindful of these signs, we tend to think this is normal. This is how a human being operates or functions, right? And this is not something that we can pay attention to. But I like to offer you the suggestion to consider that there are things that you could do, right? So burnout is real and individuals experience burnout, but it can be prevented. So when we talk about the signs to look out for, the reason I share these signs is not so that you can self-diagnose. I'm not giving you this information so that you can say, oh man, I am burnt out, or I've been burnt out, or I think I'm gonna be burnt out because I feel it coming. Like, that's not the purpose of me sharing these things. The reason I'm sharing this is to build self-awareness. One thing that was transformational in my own personal experience, my own personal journey, was, you heard in my story a little bit earlier that I dealt with depression. And the moment I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, it changed my life. Because now I had a name for what I was experiencing. Up until that point, I thought I was going crazy. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I lost myself and I would never go back to the old me. But then I found out that everything that I was experiencing was an obvious sign of depression. I could now take a breath. Because now it meant that if this is a real thing, then I can get help for this real thing. Imagine, I want you to imagine, right? Imagine when COVID started, right? And everything started to shut down and everyone was distancing themselves, right? And what's funny is when I share this, I say, you know, before we knew that it was COVID and we knew the signs, I still don't think we really know what COVID is, but let's just pretend like we do, right? So let's just imagine that individuals are experiencing these different symptoms, experiencing these different signs, but have no idea what COVID is, have no idea what the thing is that they're experiencing. All of a sudden they lose their taste, right? Lose your ability to smell things. You're coughing, you can't sleep, you're forgetful, all of the symptoms of COVID, but yet you have no idea what COVID is. That can put many people in a hopeless and helpless state because we can't name it, right? So the reason I'm sharing these signs is to give you an understanding of what it can and may look like if you are either burnt out or on the verge, right? So what causes burnout? Everyone here has probably heard of or have seen this pyramid before, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's Abraham Maslow. I like to call him my uncle, but it's not really my uncle. We just share the same first name. But Maslow talks about the different levels, right? Our needs in regards to at a very foundational level. And then if we go more specifically, what it looks like when we are operating and we have self-actualization. For the purpose of this workshop, we're specifically going to talk about at the foundational level, physiological needs, right? So things like breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. So when we think about physiological needs, if there's something that is not listed here, I'd like to hear from you. What are some physiological needs, these things that we just must have? Drop in the chat if you'd like to share. What are those things that we must have that's not already listed here? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it and share in the chat. Food, shelter, income, safety, Wi-Fi, 100%. Those things that we just need. Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing. Wi-Fi. I shared with the staff for a school district, and that was actually the first response I got, Wi-Fi, and it just makes sense. We all need Wi-Fi, right? I'm always asking, what's the Wi-Fi password? But those are great. Thank you so much for sharing. And the reason why it's important to acknowledge these things is if we know what triggers burnout, then we can set ourselves up to prevent burnout by paying attention to the needs that we have at a physiological level, right? As a human being, these are the things that I must have, right? One of the other things that I'd like to add to it is human connection. Many times we discount the power and impact of connecting with other human beings, right? We all as human beings have an innate desire and need for human connection. And when we don't have human connection, it's detrimental to our mental, emotional, psychological, physical health. Right. So understanding that if these are the basic needs that I have, what do I need to do to make sure I'm not neglecting these basic needs and I'm feeding these basic needs? So that brings us to the 4 pillars of mental health. When I talk about the 4 pillars of mental health, it's my attempt to break it down and make it as practical as possible. So mental health, simply put, is a state of well-being. The state of well-being. When I think about prioritizing my mental health, what helps me is categorizing the ways that I can do that. So that's where the 4 pillars come in. So the first pillar is operating in your gifts and abilities. In a very simple way, this means doing those things that come natural to you. What are those things that come natural to you? Are you friendly with people and you don't really have to force it? Are you good with numbers? Are you good with statistics? Are you good with solving problems, being resourceful? What is that thing that when you do it and people see you do it, They're like, oh my gosh, that's your thing. That's what you do. And making sure that we spend time operating in those gifts, because that nurtures us and helps us to achieve that state of well-being. The other is developing your capacity to cope with stress. The easiest way I like to put this is I want you to think of a fishing bowl, right? We've all seen at some point that small fishing bowl that can, have 1 or 2 fish, probably not any more than that, right? And this is fishing bowl, and we got the 2 fish swimming around. But then you put that side by side with an aquarium, right? I want you to think big, like SeaWorld. Anybody been to SeaWorld? Yeah, maybe. No, not yet. Oh, Marlon, you got to visit. So SeaWorld or some sort of aquarium, right? And you see the aquarium where a whole whale can fit in this aquarium. So when we think about building our capacity, developing our capacity, it is shifting from that small fishing bowl to getting closer and closer to that aquarium, right? And the way we do that is by strategically working on building our capacity, right? Nurturing our mental health, operating in our gifts. And that helps us to be able to take on more stress and cope in a more effective way, doing purposeful work. And I would just go off to say, everyone who's attending this session right now, you're doing purposeful work. But how can you take the purposeful work and be more intentional with it? If you're an educator working with students on a day-to-day basis, that work is already intentional or purposeful. How can you be intentional? Rather than asking students or asking those who you work with, hey, how's math class doing? Maybe asking, hey, how is everything going on at home? Right? How is your mental health? How have you been coping with stress? It's just being more intentional to develop that relationship, because ultimately it also feeds into your own mental health. And then lastly, contributing to others. What are the things that we can do that takes us outside of self and puts us in the realm of helping another individual? Community resilience. Can anybody either come off of mute or share in the chat? What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear community resilience? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear community resilience? Anyone?
I think community resilience means like when someone is in a moment of stress or problematic situations, that they would get the help that they would need, or find that shoulder to lean on.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much for sharing, Marlon. Anyone else? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of community resilience? What's that event maybe that comes to mind when you think of community resilience? I'll take one more.
I think a great example is when an emergency or disaster occurs and the community responds to it to help others, such as all the United Way programs. Over.
Awesome. That's a great share, Dr. Steve. And typically, that's the response that we get when we hear community resilience: a natural disaster, a traumatic experience, something that shifts the way we live and operate. But very often we forget the fact that there are experiences that we have, especially in the role that you play, whether on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, a yearly basis, that exposes you to traumatic events. For example, I did this session with a group of social workers, counselors, and psychologists. And I had them do this exercise, and I would love to be able to do it with you, but we're not in person. But I had them do this exercise where I shared different scenarios, and I asked them to stand up if they had ever experienced that scenario. And so some of the scenarios that I shared was to stand up if you've ever worked with a young person or individual who experienced divorce in their household. If they came from a broken home, if they came from a divorced family. I had almost everyone stand up. All right. Stand up if you have ever worked with a young person who is grieving the loss of someone that they love. We had a lot of people stand up, especially, post-COVID. A lot of loss and deaths happened. Okay, sit down. And the next was stand up if you have ever had or worked with a student who contemplated suicide. We had some more individuals stand up. And the final question was, or statement was, to stand up if you have ever lost a student to suicide. When we think of these experiences, sometimes in the roles that we play, the roles that we take on with the responsibilities that we have, we tend to forget that we are exposing ourselves to these experiences more frequently than the typical individual, and that affects our psychology. That affects the way we see the world. That affects the way we operate in the world. And all of these experiences can be traumatic. So if that's the case and you're working with a population who is experiencing these things and you're having these conversations almost on a daily basis, what do we do? How do you cope? How do you ensure that when you leave work, you actually leave work at work? So when we talk about community resilience, yes, natural disasters, yes, hurricanes, yes, storms. But for many educators, it's almost like a daily thing. Community resilience is a measure of the sustained ability of a community to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. So when we think about and talk about community resilience, the question then becomes, how can we create a culture at your institution that fosters community resilience, where we can share resources, where we're helping each other, where we're setting healthy boundaries, and it's okay to do so, where we're practicing self-care, where we are stepping up and taking the initiative to create these safe spaces. Increasing our capacity to cope requires that we create a culture of self-care and support. So I'd love to open it up. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. How can we create this type of culture at your organization, at your institution, maybe in your household? I'd love to hear some of your ideas. You can either come off of mute or you can share in the chat. How can we create this culture of self-care and support and community resilience? Anyone like to share?
I think patience and collaboration, and just giving someone the opportunity to vent and to feel that it's an open space to grow in. And
Awesome. Oh, you can go ahead.
Oh, yep. And from there, yeah, it'll pass on to the next, because that's pretty much how leadership works. It's passing it on to the next and giving someone else the ability to grow within themselves. And
Love it. Love it. Love it. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Marlon. Great. I love it. The word patience. It's something that is very difficult for those who are impatient, like myself. But when we develop that patience, it helps to create those types of cultures. So a couple of things that we could do for ourselves and then we can do for others. I talked about contributing to others and how it's so important to step outside of self and help others. So that's another part of creating that culture. So what are some things we can do for ourselves? You can read most of it. I'll share just a couple of these from the slide here. Taking breaks. All right. I know for me, I have an alarm on my phone every 3 hours or so. And it's really just a reminder to breathe, take a couple of deep breaths, maybe get up and move around. But it's that reminder that I have throughout the day that lets me know I need to move. I need to take a break. Whatever I'm doing, stop for just a couple seconds. Right. And those are things that we can do for ourselves. Another thing is acknowledging and validating our feelings. Right. The way that you feel is important. And it's okay to feel that way. And oftentimes when you're in the role as a helping professional, because you're constantly giving and constantly serving, it can be difficult to also fill your cup. So acknowledging your feelings and validating them. And then what can we do for others in creating this culture? I would start with celebrating small wins. When you see a colleague do something that was quote small or quote big, celebrate it. I saw that. I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that I saw you pull that student to the side and have a conversation with them, right? Whatever that thing looks like in your line of work, in your household, celebrating the small wins of other individuals, and it helps to build the culture. And then lastly, having hot conversations. And I'm going to speak a little bit more on this in the next slide, but hot conversations, right? Y'all are going to like this. So in the picture, this is gold being refined and purified. And I was doing some digging and some researching, and I found that gold goes through this process where it's extreme heat and extreme pressure. But when it goes through that process and gets on the other end, it becomes this valuable commodity that many people spend a lot of money on. More specifically, many husbands spend a lot of money on. So as I was doing some digging and I was like, man, extreme heat, extreme pressure, that almost sounds like the human experience. Sometimes in life, we experience extreme pressure, extreme heat, and it's almost like, oh my gosh, one thing after the other. When is this thing going to give me a break? And so I came up with what I call the HOT principle, right? So HOT, it's an acronym that stands for being honest, open, and transparent. Being honest starts with being honest with yourself, developing that self-awareness, checking in with you, asking yourself, how have I been thinking lately? How have I been feeling lately? How have I been behaving lately? Telling you the truth, and then being open. This is when we're open to trying something new, open to doing something different. Albert Einstein says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, yet expecting different results. And then being transparent. This is when we are authentic with our trusted team. Who is in our inner circle, in our support network that we can trust, that we can speak truth with and to, and making sure that we create those spaces so that we can be hot, because in turn, that enhances our own mental health. Dwight Eisenhower says, what is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. There's a framework that really speaks to setting boundaries. Put a 7 in the chat if it's difficult for you to set boundaries when it comes to work activities. Is it just me? Like, do you tend to take work home sometimes? You tend to talk about work in every conversation. Is it just me? Okay, I see a couple of you. I'm not by myself. So there's this framework that I really love, right? And I'm only going to spend a couple of seconds on this, but it's about identifying what is important, what's not important, what is urgent, what's not urgent. I like to simplify it and say we're always juggling balls. Some of these balls are plastic and some of these balls are glass. If we drop the plastic balls, we can recover. We can pick it up. If we drop the glass balls, it shatters. That's it. Identifying what is most important, those are our glass balls. identifying what can we put to the side, those are our plastic balls, and knowing what is what and how to delegate, how to eliminate, how to schedule, and when to do the thing, right? And this can ultimately change how we live and how we work and ensure that we create these healthy boundaries. Now, Brene Brown, she says something, some of you may be familiar with Brene Brown and her work, but I love this quote: daring greatly means the courage to be vulnerable. It means to show up and be seen. It means to ask for what you need, to talk about how you're feeling, and to have the hard conversations. What we realize when we have these hard conversations, it creates space for meaningful connections and relationships that go on long after situations are gone. I found in many relationships that the people that I'm closest to, we have that closeness because we have had the hard conversations. We've built that level of trust. Right. So having those hard conversations. So in talking about the 4 pillars of mental health, I'll go through this really quickly. I want to save some time for a couple of questions before we dive into one last activity that I want to share with you all around creating healthy boundaries and how to do so practically. I'd like for you to pull out your phones, and I really want to hear from you in just, this will take only about 60 seconds or so. Has this been helpful so far? Has this information been helpful? You can pull out your phones, scan the QR code, or we're going to share in the chat a link that you can go to that URL and complete this very quick survey. Once you scan the QR code, you'll type in speaks. And then at the end of this quick survey, you're going to receive a mental health resource guide where we've compiled a ton of resources, apps, and opportunities for you to prioritize your mental health. So I'll give you 60 seconds and I'll come back in about 60 seconds after you've completed that. DJ, do we have any music?
We sure do. You guys hear that?
No, not really.
No? Okay.
I got a whole stack here for you. Thank you. Thank you for letting me get it.
All right, we are back. We are back. I'm going to move forward to this last activity about establishing healthy boundaries. And you will have an opportunity if you haven't yet completed the survey. We're going to share the link in the chat. Feel free to do so as we're going over this last activity. So I want to give a scenario, and I want you to think about this scenario in terms of establishing healthy boundaries. And we're actually going to do this together. And I'd love it if some of you can come off of mute to answer a couple of these questions. So when we talk about establishing healthy boundaries, it's recognizing that boundaries are important, and that's what creates the culture of self-care and support. So the scenario is, Coworkers are gossiping about Kelly because they've seen pictures of her wild weekend on social media. One coworker approaches you to discuss Kelly's behavior. What do? You're at work. These conversations have nothing to do with work. And how can we respond? So a couple of things that we can do. Step one, using I statements. I feel blank, naming that feeling and or emotion, right? Bringing it back to how this stepping over the boundary affects me as an individual. So I feel, for example, uncomfortable talking about or listening about you talk about Kelly. Step two is naming the trigger. When doing XYZ, I feel uncomfortable when doing blank, right? So I feel uncomfortable when gossiping about someone else or hearing you gossip about someone else, engaging in this conversation. So naming the trigger. And the last step is stating why, right? So because blank. So in this particular scenario, it's because Kelly is a friend of yours. You don't like gossip, and or you're too busy to gossip. You got too many responsibilities to be thinking about, right? And so this is one practical way to establish a healthy boundary that helps you to be effective in your work, in your household, and in any other thing that you're engaging in. So I'm actually going to share these slides, and I'd love for you all to play around with some of these scenarios. Maybe grab a friend, a colleague, and practice some of these scenarios, because the goal is then to really create the safe space where we're prioritizing self-care and we're creating a culture around support. So we have a few other scenarios that I'll share with you once we wrap it up. When you take care of yourself, remember this, when you take care of yourself, you put yourself in a better position to take care of your students and families. So as much as you are pouring out, we have to also be pouring in. Also want to share that we do have part 3 of the Beating Burnout series. Part 3 is next month. Again, it is a workshop, a webinar very similar to this, covering the ways that we can develop a health plan that we can actively work towards prioritizing our mental health. If you'd like to register for that, we'll share information with you in the follow-up email, but this is definitely following up from today's webinar. And then last but not least, we have a ton of resources that we've compiled for you. The Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988. Anyone can call or text 988 to receive support. The crisis text line, if you text HOME, home, to 741-741, you can receive support. And then if you visit speakstoinspire.com/resources, we have a resource guide accessible for you and the students and colleagues that you serve and support. With that being said, I would love to open it up. If we have maybe a minute, I see we are a couple minutes over time. If we have maybe a minute to answer any questions or thoughts that anyone would like to either share in the chat or that you would like to come off of mute and share with us before we wrap it up.
I have a question.
Sure.
So